Brandon, thank you very much. And thank you to Jason. Of course, elsewhere in cyberspace is Julia and I think Kevin Weinstein. Great to know you all, and thank you so much for these opportunities, not only to do classes at your cool and ever-growing organization and new space, but also this one too. This is fun. This is fun. So I'll jump into it without much further ado. As a caveat, let me tell you, I finished this thing. I told Brandon, I said, dude, talk for a long time. And you don't have to talk about me for a long time, although it surely wouldn't hurt if you did. But talk for a long time if you can, because I got to finish this. I think I finished it literally 42 seconds ago. I got a glass of water. There might be a few rough edges on a few areas. If I recognize those, I'll either talk around them or fix them as I go. I have a friend who's a carpenter, and he always says that the last day of the job is what he calls the Schniggelfest. And the Schniggelfest is where you go around and you fix all that stupid ass stuff that's hanging out or leaning the wrong way or a little dusty, bent nails, and a few other things you didn't get to. So I'm going to do the Schniggelfest on the fly. We'll fix and patch as we go. I think now, excuse me. I think now I'll share my screen and get started. I'm going to do this as a PowerPoint. I'm going to talk over the PowerPoint. You all are welcome to ask questions as we go. If I feel I'm on a roll, and if knowing where I'm going next, I don't feel this is a time to kind of stop the car and interrupt the journey, then I simply won't answer your question. But of course, it's still there in our chat section, and I hope we'll get to it at the end. But if I see anything that seems urgent and that we need to address in the very moment, I will do my best to. Also, for your information, Jason has promised to kind of keep an eye on those chats and to keep me apprised of things I need to know. If I'm not loud enough, if I'm too loud, maybe the time, whatever. So it's likely that you'll hear his voice leaping into the mix at some point saying, dude, go faster, go slower, be smarter, whatever. That's it. But I guess the other caveat that I will say is the history of photography is long and it's very wide. Self-consciously, this is mostly a history of American photography in the 19th and 20th centuries. Surely the Eastern world, I guess what I mean is the world other than our Western world, Western Europe and these states. Surely those folks over these many generations have contributed mightily to the history of photography. Time just doesn't permit me to talk about all of their essential contributions today. I wanted to hit bases that you might be glancingly familiar with. In other words, I want to connect dots that you already might feel are there. And so to give you a feeling for photography in our Western world and our kind of American sphere these last 200 years. So that's my caveat. There's lots of other stuff out there, tons of other stuff. And as we go along, maybe I'll wave at that stuff and let you know that it's there. I suggest keeping a list and Googling people when we're done with this. All right, so let's begin by sharing, and then I'll go straight to my Microsoft PowerPoint. Camera Obscura. Jason, can you give me a thumbs up that that's indeed what you're seeing?
Looking good, my man.
Thank you. So I think one of the things I want you to think of as we go, think about as we go, and you can surely apply this, well, you can apply this to your own life. I always try to draw those lessons from photography. Bizarrely, I think photography has tons and tons of life lessons for us all. Anyway, as we go, pay attention to how a variety of forces come into confluence to create photography. As I say, my life is like this. I presume yours is. There's always a variety of forces working upon us, some stronger than others at different times. And they produce results in our lives. They produce results and outcomes in history, et cetera, et cetera. So nothing ever blooms fully into life solely on its own. There are several forces at work. And I think the forces that were brought to bear on the beginnings of photography were optics and the camera obscura. And as a subtext, I think one of the forces brought to bear were economics. At the time that photography bloomed in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, Britain ruled the world. It was a naval power. It was a very powerful and extremely wealthy trading nation, a colonial power, that's for sure. And sorry to say, that's where a lot of their wealth was derived. But what that meant was that a leisure class was created, a notch below the aristocracy. These were the sons and daughters of wealthy merchants and owners of patents, frankly. And those folks grew to become the gentleman scientists of the era. Think of Charles Darwin. He was a gentleman scientist. There were 1 million of those dudes living in huge houses with laboratories, as they called them, stuff that they had bought online, quote unquote, gathered over many years, beakers and test tubes and microscopes and flanges, all sorts of crap that they used to satisfy their curiosity wherever their curiosity roamed. Many of these guys were, and it was mostly guys, were botanists as well as chemists, as well as ornithologists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They were a leisure class, very curious, somewhat educated, and they had money to burn. So they made trips and they committed explorations. And so those folks started bumping up against some stuff that had been in the environment for a while. Chief among them, the camera obscura. Camera obscura goes all the way back to Da Vinci and further. Da Vinci has notes and drawings about the camera obscura. Basically, as you could see from this picture, and it is a true fact, a camera obscura is a very simple machine. It's a box which has a hole in one end and a flat plane, let's say it's a wall, on the other side. And it took people a long time to realize how it worked, but for a long time they realized that it worked. Light rays from the world converge upon that hole, as they do on every surface of our environment, especially our built environment. The light rays converged on that hole, turned themselves inside out, and were projected on the back wall. If you could shut down all the doors and curtains in your house, drill a hole in one wall, and conveniently enough, if you had another flat perpendicular or parallel wall just opposite, you would see the same effect as in this photograph. People for years had been using those to amuse themselves, but also artists use them to to create drawings that were exact in their verisimilitude. In fact, it is believed that the Renaissance discovery of perspective came from artists using camera obscuras. Suddenly they were drawing and tracing the stuff that bloomed on an opposite wall, and they thought, that's weird. There's all these lines that go off at an angle. We never really noticed that before. They hadn't been trained to see it. And suddenly, as artists, they began to realize that they could draw in a way that imitated the depth of three-dimensional experience. And so perspective was born, we think, via a camera obscura. Okay, this is an artist using a camera obscura to make a drawing, something like this. And as you can see, there's not many steps in between this big ass room and then a smaller room that's got a lens in it, and this thing here, which resembles a camera. So over time, this parlor toy became a more serious tool of artists. People built boxes smaller, they installed cool lenses, and they created cameras. The camera obscura that you see here is here where I live, and where I think many of you live, in Los Angeles or Southern California. This is in Santa Monica, as you probably know. You can go there anytime. So you might also imagine that people who were doing this began to think, wouldn't it be cool if there was a way that this stuff could create itself? In other words, if we could capture the photograph that's being projected onto that screen, wouldn't it be great if I didn't have to draw it, if there was some way to just capture it and freeze it? And so elsewhere in the world, people were working on such a thing. In other words, freezing, so to speak, the effects of light as it falls on a flat surface. As I say, so elsewhere, people were working on light-sensitive coatings that they could apply, let's say, to paper, and shapes would be burnt into that paper thereby. It was only a matter of time between when that bunch of people working independently, gentlemen scientists off on their own, before those folks started intermingling with the camera obscura crowd, and so photography was slowly born. Just to show how this works, here's a photograph by a contemporary artist, Abelardo Morello. He did these first couple pictures in black and white. You'll see some color thereafter. What he did was, in particularly splendid locations around the world, he would, let's say, rent a hotel room, maybe it's an Airbnb, across from the Duomo, right, in Florence, or across from the Eiffel Tower in Paris, France. He'd get as close as he could, maybe he'd borrow somebody's apartment, and then he would shut it down. Him and his assistants would do a meticulous program that they'd already well practiced. They'd shut it down, shut the curtains down, et cetera, install a lens in between one of the curtains, let's say, and lo and behold, these things, the Eiffel Tower, are projected upside down into the room. He would then photograph the scene before him. That's a long exposure. It's 4 or 5 hours for sure. Here's some of his color work. Obviously, this is in New York City. Elsewhere. That's pretty cool. But that shows you exactly how a camera obscura works in a room that's set up to kind of receive the message, right? And you can imagine how the ancients thought, holy shit, this is amazing. If only there was a way that we could freeze this right here and now. They called it automatic. Automatic writing is what they called it. And so, again, these two routes began to converge. the camera obscura that everyone had known of, the chemistry that was being developed by a variety of people over time in the early 19th century, and the science of optics. At some point, all of this converged in the person, or on the person, of Louis Daguerre. This is Louis Daguerre, and as you're probably familiar, Daguerre created the Daguerreotype. So here's a Daguerreotype of Daguerre. It's kind of like that old joke about Lou Gehrig getting Lou Gehrig's disease, but there's probably a sunnier joke in here somewhere about Louis Daguerre being memorialized in a Daguerreotype. So here is the first Daguerreotype that Daguerre made. This is a photograph from his studio, and another one from his window, said to be the oldest known photograph of human beings. Kind of down there in the left-hand corner, there is a shoeshine dude and a customer, right? So this was not photography in toto. This was not the finished and definitive version of photography. It was a positive, a direct positive, so-called, which means that when the photo was finished, the photo itself was finished, it looked like a photo, albeit on a curved piece of copper, a direct positive. You shoot it, you process it, and now it's a thing you can look at. Later on, someone would learn how to make negatives out of this. So the difference is that a direct positive, when it pops up, albeit after a couple hours and a ton of work with stinky chemicals, when it pops up, it's a done thing. A negative is not so. When the negative pops up, it is not yet a photograph. It's the reverse of a photograph. So there's yet another part of the process that turns negatives into prints. It might seem on paper, so to speak, that that's an extra step. Why bother? The Daguerreotype seems like the way to go. But when one creates a negative, one can thereby make print after print after print after print after print. As a commercial venture, that makes more sense. One can shoot a photograph of whatever and make 1 million prints and sell 1 million prints. So people who had their eyes on commerce right from the beginning knew that we needed a way to make this reproducible. That's the capitalist notion. You do the work once, you get paid for it 100 times, right? And Daguerre and his people were not innocent of that information or those ambitions. Here's a Daguerreotype setup. There's that camera. The Daguerreotype process, in short, required a sheet of copper rounded at the edges to be bathed in a certain solution, a silver solution that was sensitive to light, then placed into the camera. The image is made, and then that piece of copper and its actuated surface needs to be fumed, that's what they call it, fumed with mercury, and then leaded with gold, believe it or not, gilded with gold. And so that's how Daguerreotypes were made, and they were always a one-off. It's a piece of copper, there's only one of them, only one of them. And so, and by the way, it's very fragile. The gilding, the gold layer, actually makes it stronger and tougher. If it weren't for that, you could almost blow the picture off like dust from the cover of a book, let's say. So the gilding made it stronger, but even at that, it was very fragile and vulnerable to scratches, etc. So they would put it in a case, And you'll see a couple of those cases here in a second. So here's the process. You'll see behind our sitter, there's a kind of a stand and a couple prongs that seem to be spearing him in the head. That's because it took 20, 30 seconds sometimes to create these exposures. And it was important that throughout the sitter not move. They were allowed to blink, but not to move their head otherwise. And so these contraptions held their heads in place. Here's Abraham Lincoln and Edgar Allan Poe. Here's a daguerreotype of, this is a photograph of this is the oldest ever photograph of the oldest American president to be photographed. Is that I don't know how to conjugate that, but basically this is John Quincy Adams, our fifth president, I believe, in his old age. So he is photographed as a very old man in about 1940 by someone with a daguerreotype camera and process at hand. Mostly, however, it was ordinary people. Here are a couple gold rushers. Normal folk, working folk. But look at the detail, spectacular detail. These things were small, by the way. They're about as big as a paperback novel. So, but I mean, spectacular detail. The single most photographed man of the 19th century is Frederick Douglass, the great African-American orator and abolitionist. The single most photographed man of the 19th century. So Henry Fox Talbot, among several other people, this is Talbot, was at work on the negative process. If we can create a negative rather than that daguerreotype with which we are stuck as a one-off, we can make multiple copies. This is his first ever negative made of these windows in about 1841. This negative is about as big as a postage stamp. He had kind of an artistic eye, frankly, somewhat of a lyrical eye himself. This is a photograph he made at about the same time on his property, you know, his estate. He was one of those guys, the gentleman scientists. Here's another one. You know, he's got a great eye for composition, considering that photographs were an utterly new thing on the face of the planet. This guy conjured a kind of a composition that works. One today would be proud of this composition. So I want to stop and say, just for a second, photography was not discovered. I've made a point of not using that word. Although it's going to pop out any second, I'm sure. Photography was announced, more or less, and it was announced by people who created patents. So this was smack in the middle of the industrial age, and these guys were no strangers to how business is done on an industrial scale. That's where they got their money. And as a result, their leisure, right? So they got to study birds because their brother-in-law, let's say, owned a railroad track, whatever, right? So they got where money come from, and they knew that having a patent on these processes mattered. So Fox Talbot announced the patent, beating Daguerre to that privilege. And so just to say, all of those, a great many under-recognized folks over several decades contributed in bits and pieces to the optics and to the chemistry of photography in those days. And so no one discovered it. It was stuff coming together, men who knew each other, men of means who knew each other, and corresponded with one another and read about each other in the papers and watched each other's speeches at the academy, right? The Academy of Amateurs. That's a big deal. The British Society, that was all amateurs, and it was just wealthy dudes who had figured out how a bird's wing worked, and they delivered a paper. But in fact, their only actual authority was they had lots of money and time to study birds' wings, right? So all these guys, they kind of know each other. It's a clubby men's club, and they share with one another. And the dude who wins the race to the patent office is the guy who goes down in history. Frederick Scott Archer created the process for doing Fox Talbot's negatives on glass. Fox Talbot's negatives had been on paper. Archer's negatives were on glass, and it's the wet plate collodion process. Here's a Matthew Brady photograph using that process here in Pennsylvania, in America, during the Civil War. This is said to be the oldest known portrait of a Victorian using that process, about 1845. And this very pixely image might be Theodore Roosevelt. It didn't look like that. It didn't look that pixely when I set it up. Sorry about that. This is my favorite. These two rock. They can come to my party. These are eminent Victorians on wet glass. So as you can imagine, the next leg of the race goes to whomever can figure out how to stop using glass and start using something else, anything else that's not wet, right? Because you have to prepare those wet plates in the field. You have to actually have a little wagon dragging behind you when you're making photographs in order to prepare wet plates in the field and process them in the field. So whomever can figure out how to get away from wetness and glass is gonna win the next championship. So these two, Richard and Charles, Dick and Chuck, figured out how to make a dry plate, so-called. Which leads to George Eastman, who figures out how to put it on something like celluloid, a strip of clear plastic, and to package that more or less for the masses. In fact, George Eastman in 1888 introduces, and this is Eastman himself, by the way, introduces the Brownie Camera. And the Brownie Camera is a camera designed to be used by anyone, anywhere. I believe their motto in the advertisements was, you just press the button and we'll do the rest. I think we'll see one of those ads in a second, so you can correct my memory of that advertising slogan. It is thought that this is also Eastman, but we're not quite sure. Anyway, you get a good feeling for a guy holding that a little box, smaller than a bread box. It was loaded with 100 shots on a roll. And so you see the winding knob on top. You would shoot the picture, wind the knob to the next frame, shoot 100 of them, then put it back in its box and mail it back to Rochester, New York in the USA, where George Eastman's people would process your negatives, create prints, send all of that back to you in the box with the camera, loaded with 100 more frames of fresh film. The Brownie took the world by storm. Here, by the way, is a picture from, I think it's Omaha in the 1890s. You can see that this is a round picture. The fact of the matter is that images you begin to create with your DSLRs are also round. It's just that your sensor is square, so it crops out all that curvy stuff around the sides. Everybody could use one, and everybody did. Within 5 years, George Eastman had a multi-million-dollar business on his hands. This is a somewhat later version of the Brownie. And at a certain point, public demand had created a market for home developing kits. So this is a home developing kit from the 1910s, sold by George Eastman and Company, known also as Kodak. Around that time, photographers began experimenting with cameras and that technology for various uses. I think that's a word always you should kind of keep close by when you're thinking about photography. It is one thing, photography that is, it is one thing, but its use is another thing. The way photography is used is a separate issue. Muybridge wanted to win a bar bet, and the bar bet among him and his fellow travelers at the Gentlemen's Club in Palo Alto, California, was settle this: does a galloping horse ever fully leave the ground? Now, for hundreds of years, gentlemen at gentlemen's clubs had always concluded that horses never fully left the ground. There was always one hoof on the ground at some point. And so Muybridge set about trying to win this bet once and for all and demonstrate that indeed the horse does leave the ground at some point. And we can see that it's frame number 3. He did this by using, as you can see, 12 cameras with tripwires, and each camera made a single photograph as the horse galloped by. Clearly, this is a precursor to cinema, and it excited the interest of Thomas Edison directly. Edison and Muybridge corresponded, and Edison kind of used these photographs to begin thinking about how to create his kinescopes and then his movie technology for capture and for presentation. More from Muybridge. There he is himself, an extremely colorful dude. At one point, he shot and killed his wife's lover, but prevailed in court. His argument was that, yeah, I'm crazy. Those people drove me crazy. Wouldn't you do this if you were me, judge? And the judge had to concede that maybe he would. And so Muybridge, that was the Muybridge defense, was, you know, you'd have to be nuts not to. A few more from Muybridge. And I think you can see in these photographs the seeds of Cubism, Cubist paintings, of which Marcel Duchamp and Picasso, Georges Braque must have been aware. If you smashed all these pictures together in one frame, they might be a nude descending staircase. Now, by the way, I must draw your attention to something that I'm sure you've already noticed. All of these poor photographers don't have any births or death dates. They were neither born nor they died. Sorry about that. This was a template that I made and tacked each photographer's name to it and thought I'd come back later. But I never got back later. Sorry about that. So here's old Carlton Watkins. Again, the use of photography. So Muybridge was a kind of a technocrat. using photography in technical ways to provide evidence about the world. Watkins was not a technocrat. However, he was providing evidence about the world to a public that was ecstatic to look at his pictures. He traveled to the West to make photographs of the Yosemite Valley and other areas in California that in the 1860s were utterly new to the American public back east. People in Philadelphia simply had never seen anything as crazy as this. These pictures, which were turned into photogravures for publication in newspapers and magazines, and also made into large prints, stunned people. People couldn't imagine that their country included this. So Watkins created a sense of America for people in New York and the Midwest that they hadn't expected and they almost couldn't believe. It was based on these photographs that President Lincoln at the time set Yosemite aside. The national park system didn't exist until Theodore Roosevelt, but President Lincoln set aside, shall we say, Yosemite, the Yosemite Valley, based on these photographs. But another thing is Watkins, again, like Fox Talbot, you'll remember I said of Fox Talbot that considering he was one of the very first people ever in the universe to point a camera at anything, he had a pretty decent eye. Well, Watkins had an even better eye, and in a way he created a certain way of photographing landscape. It's almost unimaginable to me to think about how boggling it must have been to set a camera up in front of a landscape, never having seen a photograph before. Where do you point the camera? Is the horizon actually the horizon? Do we turn to the left or right? Do we turn up or down? How do we organize the stuff in the frame if you've never seen a photograph before? Let me ask you this. If you had never heard the Beatles or anyone since 1963, how would you begin to write a pop song? How in the world do you begin to even imagine what it might be, right? So he created, in a way, the first kind of photographic evidence of how two-dimensional space might be arranged in a camera. I mean, that's such a modern composition. Spectacular to me that he would have thought of it, period. And again, people back east seeing these damn trees, that must have flipped their lids. I told you that those photographers traveled with these huge rigs. And of course they did, because to make this picture, you have to set that up in the field and sensitize your plates, expose the plates, and then develop the negatives all at the same time. Kind of running your glass up and down the hill. Your assistant is doing one thing while you're doing another thing. Roger Fenton was a British photographer who photographed the Crimean War. This is his rig. So at some point, someone was going to start doing what they considered to be art. That was Julia Margaret Cameron making portrait art. Her understanding of light is extremely sophisticated for the time. This photograph of Sir Edgar Herschel, who was also a chemist who did contribute to the earliest stages of photographic chemistry, you know, one of the 300 people who did. Sir Herschel is bathed in amazing light. This is the kind of picture Annie Leibovitz would make. It's, to me, to my eye, super modern. And by the way, people like Annie Leibovitz study these pictures all the time. They're haunting the museums and the galleries, and they look at these, and then they use this strategy to photograph Jim Carrey, let's say. Again, these are people who had seen 100 photographs in their life, if that. They had been confronted with less than 100 actual photographs in their entire lives. And then they make this. To me, that's incredible. It's incredible to think that you would know where to place anything and also gather emotion and also arrange everything in the right light. She set up tableau scenes depicting Bible stories, etc. This woman might look familiar to you, but she's not her. This is actually Virginia Woolf's mom, who happened to have been Miss Cameron's niece. There's a ton of these pictures, and I think, wow, she photographed Virginia Woolf? She must have been very old, and Ms. Woolf very young. But this is in fact Virginia Woolf's mom, Julia, and she had a different last name, of course, the niece of Julia Margaret Cameron. Edward S. Curtis, there he is, a very dashing dude. I mean, would that I could look like that. That is a handsome guy. In great light. I mean, that's Annie Leibovitz light, dude. That's amazing to me. He took his cameras onto the plains to make photographs of Native Americans. These photographs are, as you might imagine, problematic these days. The questions about exploitation and appropriation are obvious, and they attend every conversation about Curtis. But so there's that, full stop. Also, he was said to be a great lover of this culture, who respected all the tribes he met. Not that that would actually defend one against charges of exploitation, but still in all. And it's true to say that he spent his own money for 30 years to make these images. So he is always a great conversation when the topic turns to photographers kind of journeying into cultures they might not understand and picturing those cultures, representing those cultures. Still in all, it's a hell of a record. It's a hell of a record. He was funded by Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie gave him something like $100,000 to create 100 portfolios of these images over 20 or 30 years. And so that's a lot of money in 1910. However, it did run out after a while. 30 years is a long time. And it is said that Curtis spent about $1 million of his own, and he died penniless. The French photographer, Eugene Atget, photographed the last days of old Paris. Again, our theme is, how is photography used? What is the intention of these people? In Curtis's case, it was to capture a vanishing race, which is in the bloodstream of American photography, world photography, in fact, in the documentary mode. The documentary mode is based on social justice and capturing what threatens to vanish. That was Curtis's motive. It was Atget's motive. As you'll remember, Bonaparte #3 in the 1860s gave the assignment to Baron Haussmann to rethink Paris. So I think we think Paris is ancient. these crazy winding streets, so intimate and ancient. In fact, most of them are newer than the 1860s or 70s, when Haussmann knocked down half of Paris to build a new design, all those grand, broad boulevards going to the horizon, meeting each other at angles in plazas and gardens. That's fairly new under the sun. That is Baron Haussmann in the 1870s and 80s. It was a project, naturally, that lasted 50 or 60 years. And about halfway through, Eugene Atget, a local portrait photographer, thought, holy shit, somebody needs to photograph this stuff before it goes away. So that's an interesting thing for us to contemplate, I think, that someone in 1890 would have been interested in a vanishing world. Even then, there were vanishing worlds. Even then, progress was knocking stuff down. So this is old Paris, older than the old Paris we think we know, photographed by Atget. And again, for me, this is someone who is creating, almost out of whole cloth, a catalog of compositional strategies that were new to the world. I would make this photograph this way. You probably would too. But if we had been dropped down from Mars in 1890, would we have done that? Or would we have just fainted, right? Atget had the presence of mind to create a whole way of doing architecture and the built environment, the compositions, foreground and background. It's a spectacular accomplishment that I would argue we all have the benefit of in our current lives. I don't think I'd be making pictures the way I do if he hadn't done that. It was him doing that, and then Bernice Abbott doing that, and then some other dudes doing that, and then it was 1970, and then it was 2000, and now I do what I do. I think Atget was one of our geniuses. I think he taught us how to see into dimensions, to see 3 dimensions, right? So I have stairs and a cityscape at an angle to my camera. I'm translating it into 2 dimensions. In those days, the mind that conceived of these outcomes is kind of a genius mind, I would think. That's Einsteinian as far as I'm concerned. He photographed windows. He was a precursor to Lee Friedlander in that way. Friedlander has a whole project that's not dissimilar from this. These leading lines, I think that's all new. That's all new in the world. And look at that over on the far right, the Bass logo. It's still the same today. Atget mostly did architecture. He did do some people. That woman we saw at the very beginning is kind of one of my all-time favorite of his pictures, which is interesting since he did it rarely. So at the time that he's doing this work, creating what amounts to photographic art, people elsewhere, other photographers, also have ideas about art. They are dying to create something that will gain the respect of gallerists and museum folk. And that has been photography's great ambition all along, is to get into the galleries and to be considered alongside the Picassos, etc. This is Alfred Stieglitz, who was a spectacular and innovative photographer in his own right, but also a supporter, an organizer, a promoter of photography at the turn of the century. He created the magazine called Camera Work, the first photo magazine. They used the photogravure process of reproduction to print his magazine, which is considered one of the great accomplishments of the 20th century. The 10, 15 years of that magazine are a great, great record of not only what that world looked like, but also how artists, photographic artists, sought to turn those images into something that they believed could be in a museum. Here's an Edward Steichen using the gum bichromate process. Now, by this time, everybody's making negatives. To repeat, the daguerreotype is a thing of the distant past. The daguerreotype is a direct positive on copper. Then there were paper negatives from Fox Talbot. Then Archer showed us the wet plate negative, and other folks, including George Eastman, showed us how to create negatives on other surfaces like celluloid. So once you have negatives and can thereafter make a print from the negative, then you can start monkeying around with that very print. Gum bichromate was a substance that one spread on top of the print and manipulated. It was a viscous, gooey thing on top of the photograph, into which some aspect of the photograph was actually embedded, and one could move it around with a paintbrush and create painterly effects. So people like Edward Steichen, whom we just saw, and others sought to use those techniques to create a painting from a photograph. That's how desperate these photographers were to make pictures that didn't look like pictures. Stieglitz, again, here he is, used atmospheric effects. He had lots of pictures of clouds and steam and rain and sleet and fog, because the Impressionists, who were the last great photographic art movement, painting movement at that time, they were the last great art heroes. They had painted atmosphere. They had painted sun and its effects. They had painted fog and wind on the water, right? And so Stieglitz and his friends constantly photographed atmospheric effects in an attempt to make photographs that looked impressionist. Also, they monkeyed with the focus of the cameras. If things went out of focus, as they are in this Clarence White pictures, that was thought to be less photographic, which was good, more painterly. Here's a copy of Camera Work magazine. Splendid, splendid. Here's another Clarence White, slightly out of focus. Thought to be, it gave atmospherics a nudge even further into atmosphere. Stieglitz again, photographing atmospherics. The belief was that this was how art, photographic art, could look. Edward Steichen, probably the greatest known of Stieglitz's crowd. In fact, Steichen, a man of some wealth, lent Stieglitz a room in a building, in a storefront in New York City, so that Stieglitz could create his gallery. So Stieglitz is not only a photographer, he is the master of Camera Work magazine, and now he's a gallerist. His gallery came to be known as the 291 Gallery. It had another name earlier. I believe it was called the Galleries of the Photo Secession, but it became known as 291 because that was its address on whatever, 20th Street. So Steichen was a benefactor to Stieglitz, but also one of the great photographic figures of the 20th century by a mile. Steichen began as an arch pictorialist. I think I neglected to say that those folks who gathered in Camera Works magazine and in the galleries of 291 were called pictorialists, right? They hoped to create a pictorial effects on or with photographs. As you can see, Steichen was surely one of them. The soft focus, the low contrast prints. This is one of his best known. It's a sunset near a pond in Ossining, New York, or some suburb of New York City. We've seen this a few minutes ago. This is his Renoir. He photographed Auguste Renoir. And again, a painterly quality to that. You can see the gum bichromate at work here. He's made a photograph with whatever light is available and then beat the shit out of it with that gum and those brushes. J.P. Morgan. Very spooky stuff, right? All these people were basically creating book covers. That would be like a noir novel. They would reprint the entire, blah, blah series of New York crime novels. Penguin. But Steichen changed his mode after a while. In a minute, we'll see how others followed him in changing that mode, Stieglitz included. But Steichen changed his mode, became more of a straight photographer after a while, and then became the first staff photographer in the Condé Nast chain of magazines. He worked for Vogue, I think. And so at that, he basically created celebrity photography. What a super change. I think the through line is he has a great, spectacular sense for what the picture is. He has a great sense of the drama that light gives a photograph, and he's surely not afraid of black. We'll see that in these celebrity pictures that he makes in the 20s and 30s. The great Dietrich, Charlie Chaplin. He was a master of lighting effects in the studio, an early master, incredible to imagine. Gloria Swanson. That, although he might look like the young Lincoln, is Steichen himself. Now, the thing about Steichen is that after he spends 15 years as a pictorialist and then changes his feathers and does straight photography with lights in a studio for another 15 or 20 years, he then goes to war, as did everyone. And when he pops out the other side in the late 40s, becomes the first curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art. And he's the one who mounts the Family of Man show. We'll talk about that later. Many of you have that book. In his dotage, Steichen, still an energetic dude, created this whole new thing in photography. As I say, not afraid of black. Lighting effects, not afraid of black. Incredible. Paul Robeson. I would say if you compared Steichen to Annie Leibovitz, that would be really a fair comparison, super fair comparison. And I guess the only thing I'd remind you of is that he invented this stuff. Here he is again. This is a great way to make a transition into photographic modernism. So all those folks, fellow travelers of Stieglitz and Steichen during the Camera Works years, had tried to make photographs that didn't look like photographs, right? They used soft focus, they used atmospherics, everything was a kind of mushy and romantic, and then they slathered gum bichromate over half of their prints and mediated the look further by using a paintbrush and gumming around in the gum. At some point, someone was bound to think, hey, why don't we just let the camera be the camera, the negative be the negative, the image be the image? And this goes hand in hand with modernism in other arts, surely in painting and in architecture and literature. Let the thing be the thing. Let's explore and exploit the thing as it is. Form follows function. And so what is the function of the camera? The camera captures, describes in spectacular detail, especially since all of these people were using large negatives, 4x5 negatives, 8x10 negatives. The Leica, a small camera, similar to your DSLR, had not yet been invented. So they're all making huge negatives with gorgeous lenses, right? In this area, there's no cheap mass marketing of lenses. These are gorgeous lenses made by clockmakers and people who have been doing this in their family for 400 years. So the camera with these big negatives can record great and gorgeous detail. It can stop action. It can do a variety of things that paintings could never do. And so the mood that takes over is, hey, let's let these cameras do exactly what they do. Just like painters had discovered 10 years earlier, a painting is about paint, goo on canvas. That's what a painting is. So let's show brushstrokes. So let's show the goop itself. It is 2 dimensions, not 3. So let's not pretend that we have volume. Let's not pretend we have depth. Let's create a kind of depth that makes sense, albeit in an avant-garde way, on a 2-dimensional surface. That's what the painters had come up against, and they had begun the long journey towards solving that. So photographers had an equal and opposite challenge. Their challenge was to use the camera for what it did best and right, which was detail, gorgeous optics, negatives. So we see, for example, Steichen, who is doing a double exposure. Paintings can't do double exposures, but cameras can. So let's do it. That's what cameras will do. Edward Weston and his cabbage. Cameras can take things out of context. They can get close. They can see and capture detail. That's what cameras do. So let's do that. Weston's cabbage. Paul Strand on Wall Street. Paul Strand again. Now, it's not to say that everyone suddenly became a crime photographer or a real estate photographer. In other words, just because the camera was going to do exactly what the camera does, doesn't mean we simply point it and be boring. Strand and others said, let's make it do exactly what it does. It captures light and shadow, exquisite detail, etc., but there's no reason we, in our point of view, in our imagination about what is photographical, there's no reason we can't create interesting stuff. We're going to make groovy compositions that use the camera as a tool that describes exact description. So here is Berenice Abbott photographing New York from above, right? So this is groovy and cool. This is weird. It's a bird's eye view and it'll kind of knock your socks off. Still in all, it's ultra straight. So it's thrilling and it's strange to see this brand new architecture. Brand new in the world are these buildings, these step back buildings in New York City. That's a new thing on the planet. Nobody else does that, but we do that here, and we can look down on them like a bird. So all that is, that's mind-boggling, but it's very straight. It describes exactly. There's no hanky-panky in the description or the atmospherics. Look at the detail. broad daylight is what we're going to use to knock these things down. Or let's use night. I mean, this is a beautiful image. This is worthy of the greatest pictorialists, except it excels in specific detail. There's no gum on here. There's no soft focus. This is New York City, and it's a cool thing to look at. Besides it being New York City, we have looked at it in such a way, under such lighting conditions, that it becomes something else. It transforms itself into a cavalcade, and yet it is exact detail of the exact world. That's what drove the modernism of Ansel Adams. This stuff is spectacular to look at, and especially the way Adams handled tones. That was kind of his thing, was to create a spectacular landscape of tones. And yet this is the real world. It looks like a dream, but it's ultra real. And I think that's part of it, is the hyper reality of the modern world can also look like a dream. Not all of the modernists did this. Some of them did monkey with stuff, but only in photographic ways, right? In the past, the pictorialists took a photograph and laid gum on top of it. Here, Man Ray, that's his name, Man Ray, solarizes these pictures of lilies and a self-portrait of his own self. What is solarization? It's a process where you kind of corrupt the chemistry of the picture in mid-development. We've all heard about photographers who throw their paper in the tray, the picture comes up, and it's a smashing moment. It's a wonderful moment for every young photographer to see their first picture come up in the tray. Well, we've also seen the comedy movies where just at that moment, somebody opens the door from the hall and runs in and says, "Hey, Benny." And Benny says, "Oh, dude, you screwed up my picture. You've opened the light on it when it was developing." Well, Man Ray did that on purpose because he found that if you did that in a certain way, if you flashed light on a half-developed print in a certain way, you would get this Sabatier effect, also known as solarization. So what he's doing is exactly what photography does. It's about chemistry. It's paper and chemistry and light. So he's exploiting a little known aspect of that kind of chemical dynamic to make these cuckoo pictures. But they are made by strictly a photographic process. At a certain point, everybody owns a camera. We're now in the second or third generation of photography, and photography is not simply artists, nor is it simply commercial folks who are making advertisements. Photography has gotten into the hands of kind of everybody, and there are a class of vernacular professionals that spring up. Here's James Van Der Zee, an African-American working in Harlem in the teens, 20s, and 30s. He is running a portrait studio in the midst of Harlem, in the middle of the Harlem Renaissance. I mean, just on paper alone, doesn't that sound like a thing? Like if I just walked up to you on the street and said, "Yeah, I've got some of those pictures. Wouldn't you like to see them?" This stuff is spectacular. This is Harlem during its great Renaissance, when poetry, novelization, painting, plays flourished at all levels of society, but especially in the affluent class, which was a new thing on the planet. An affluent class of African Americans living in New York City, up there in Harlem. This is a woman, Ethel somebody, who is apparently the original Betty Boop, the inspiration for the great cartoon animation. James Van Der Zee made 1 million of these in the studio and outside the studio. He was everywhere, hired by social clubs, funeral parlors and families who had lost a loved one. He did tons of this funerary work. Amazing to consider, but it was a huge part of his business. He photographed associations and schools. The record that he left is spectacular and lasting. At about the same time, in New Orleans, E.J. Belloc, a Creole American, had set up a studio and made his living doing portraits, etc. The same old stuff that Vanderzee may have been doing, but he was doing his among the white folk of New Orleans, except when he slipped away for his secret assignations, photographing in the Storyville neighborhood, the prostitutes there. These photographs are also an incredible document. Not only is it amazing to see how those folks were, what they wore and what their hair was, but look at the light and look at his printing. It's so creamy and cool. This picture is got to be worth millions. I've seen it represented on album covers, book covers, movie posters. This is perhaps one of the 10 great photographs, American photographs of the 20th century. Oh, there, I liked it so much I showed it again. Incredible. So we've seen James Vanderzee, a professional artist, a commercial professional artist amongst the people in Harlem. Also, E.J. Belloc among the people in New Orleans. And here's Mike Disfarmer, who is among the people in Alabama. He came from Indiana, went to Alabama, and made these photographs in the 30s and 40s. Talk about an American document. You put these three photographers together and you could spend the next year looking at these pictures. He had a little studio in Heber, Alabama, where he made these photographs. Come on, man. That's crazy. That's great. You could write a novel about that picture. That's my favorite. Who are those guys? So that's Mike Disfarmer, working in Heber, Alabama, 20s, 30s, and 40s. Andre Kertész began making photographs in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. He lived to be about 195, from Hungary, from Budapest, came from money, learned to make photographs by practicing on his brother. That's his brother. I didn't think that would be so pixely. And then came to Paris, bought a small camera and spent the rest of his life using small cameras. We could do a whole chapter on the Leica, the small camera produced by the German clockmaking firm. So they knew something about little cogs and little widgets and buttons, right? And so they created this very small handheld camera that basically changed photography. You could put in a roll and slip it into your pocket and shoot anywhere at any time. So after a while of using bigger cameras, Kertész bought a Leica and began photographing with that. So this is a bad picture of his brother. Also in Budapest before he made it to Paris. For me, also one of the great kind of street photographs of all time. Kertész was one of the most imaginative and flexible photographers, like Steichen. Oh, look it, that's another crap picture. like Steichen, he got photography in all its forms. It's a crazy crop. It's just in Paris in the 20s. Isn't that interesting? That's people doing strange and spectacular things that the rest of us will mimic for the next 100 years.
Hey, Thomas.
Yes, brother.
It's Jason. I just wanted to give you a heads up. We've got about 5 more minutes left until the 4:30 moment. And I also just want to let everyone else know if they do have questions for Tom to go ahead and put those in the chat function now, and we can take a few minutes after 4:30 to try and get to everybody's questions. Right now, there's really not a whole lot going on as far as questions.
So, Jason, as you and I discussed yesterday, when I'm looking at this, which is a PowerPoint full screen, I can't see the rest of my screen. It's, you know, it's in the ether. So I don't know what time it is. I presume, what are you saying? It's about 5 to 4?
It's 4:25 right now. So
Holy
we need,
crap. Okay.
Yeah, I told you it was gonna go quick.
I know, yes, sir. Okay, so I'll tell you what, give me another 5 minutes. I'll pop through this. And the obvious thing is we're not gonna get to the end. I can live with that if everybody else can, but I do wanna move the dial a little further. I'll do my best to kind of bang through that, okay?
Sounds great.
Okay, so Cortège, just so inventive, and as someone who sees photographs, again, all these early people, they haven't grown up looking at Life magazine. They have not grown up looking at Netflix. They have never seen a photograph in a newspaper, right? And yet when they hold that camera in their hands, they have some feeling about how to arrange the built environment and the people who walk through it in a way that at that time was utterly revolutionary. And we are still learning from these examples. So here's Cortège looking down, and what he's doing is he's creating abstract canvases. And that's one of the modernist goals, is to say, look at this. You can count the ribs on the Eiffel Tower. You can count the people down there. If it's a decent print, you can see faces, right? So there's no doubt that this is ultra specific, very descriptive, because that's what cameras do. That's our mantra. Cameras describe, so let's do that. But let's create a two-dimensional thing that swings as a two-dimensional thing. So he's created an abstract cavalcade. If you squint, these are no longer specific individuals. They're jots and swoops and diagonal lines, tones, color fields. Cortège understands the photograph separate from the three-dimensional world that produces the photograph. I have to say, I didn't expect that all these Cortège pictures would be so damn pixely. I'm so sorry about that. He loves backlight because backlight throws shadows toward the camera, and also it makes silhouettes. So you have all these groovy human-like silhouettes in the midst of a field of shadows marching toward the camera. Extremely dynamic. If I left you with anything today, young photographers, I would say backlight, backlight, backlight. Looking down on a schoolyard. Again, super specific. I can read the faces. And yet when I squint, it becomes a Kandinsky. One of his most famous kind of final photographs. As I say, he must have lived to be 90 years old, 95 years old. He died in New York City in about 1986, I think. Okay, let's move on. A couple more minutes with small cameras. Photographers who wield small cameras, right? So Cortège, Henri Cartier-Bresson, probably the father of us all. There he is as a very dashing young man. Cartier-Bresson kind of created modernist composition with a small camera. in about a year and a half, in about 1933, when he went to Cuba and Spain. After the war, Cartier-Bresson created, with Robert Capa and a guy named David Seymour, the Magnum Photography Agency. Their notion was to peddle their photographs to magazines and newspapers. The difference between that and how that had gone earlier was they would all own their copyrights and their agency would guard their interests. Magnum was its name, and they began recruiting the greatest photographers on the planet. And to this day, Magnum is kind of, it's the Mont Blanc of photo agencies. It's the Rolls Royce of photo agencies. Over its 80-year history, it is the greatest collection of modern photographers. You might have noticed these last three pictures have black borders on them. That was part of Cartier-Bresson's modernist message to those who viewed his pictures. Those black borders are actually the very edge of the negative. His printer, Cartier-Bresson, didn't print anything. He was too busy traveling the world. In years before anybody thought of traveling the world, he just traveled. But his printer filed out the negative carrier so that when he slipped the negative into the carrier, the hole was too big and you could see the blackness around the edge of the negative. Who wants to see the blackness around the edge of the negative? Cartier-Bresson said, I want to show people the blackness, because my experience in making the photograph totally is reflected in the print. In other words, no one is cropping this. No one is changing it in the darkroom. What I saw there in this case, Madrid, Spain, in 1933, what I saw in my viewfinder is exactly what my viewers see. And the proof of it, so my message to them, is there's the black border, right? So everything I see, you see. It's transmitted straight from me to you. That's how photographs and cameras and viewfinders work. Cartier-Bresson was a prisoner of war during the war. Afterwards, he photographed its aftermath and then began traveling. He went back to Paris for a while and made these famous pictures. Then he had an exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art, 1947. And then he created Magnum, brought together all of his favorite photographers under one roof. And then he hit the road and spent the next 5 years traveling in India, China, Russia, and the US. Here's the great man himself. He's said to be so attuned to his camera, he could just run and leap through the crowd, invisible to everyone, make pictures, get them perfectly in focus, and be gone before anyone knows he's there. Okay. There's more to this. You'll have to come back for part 2. That'll be next year. So everybody stay safe, stay alive for at least another year, because we have unfinished business, you and me. Okay, Jason, I'll open the floor to questions. Folks, please don't embarrass me in front of my wife, okay?
Well, I haven't been seeing really any questions put up in the chat, so I think we're in pretty good shape. Brandon, do you have anything else you want to kind of close this out for us?
I think Rollins, who's here, had a question he posted in chat. Rollins, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask that question if you like.
All right. Well, since you're picking me, I'll throw in 2 questions. Well, my first question was, you mentioned how a lot of these new photographers were picking up this black box for the first time and trying to figure out how to compose. My question would have been, well, didn't they have influences already through paintings? You know, we as photographers now we learn by looking at great examples, and I think they already had examples. There was a great artist, you know, from antiquity already creating this type of work via paintings. And that's the first question. Second question is, where do you see us today's photography? If pictorialism existed then, the advent of digital photography now, are we somewhere in between? Because we have, for letting the camera do what we want it to do, Photoshop does what it does also. So is there like some sort of merging there?
Well, I'll go for the second one first. Thank you for those. And thank you for asking something that I might actually be able to answer. So, whew. You know, my wife is a photography teacher. She teaches at universities. So, you know, we have a house full of photographers. Our cat is actually rather handy with a point and shoot also. And so we have these conversations kind of all the time. And I think the answer, it's a partial answer at best, to your question about now is, yes, Photoshop, we live in a Photoshop environment. Everything you see, and I know I'm talking to people who already know this already, but this will get me going. Everything you look at has been touched by Photoshop. Anybody who believes that Photoshop is only about moving ahead from one frame to the other, or making a mountain bigger or smaller, or making you know, LeBron James look like he's flying. No, that's the groovy kind of rock and roll part of Photoshop. But Photoshop as an everyday tool has been in use. I started using it in 1994. I think people were using versions of it as well as other machines 10 years before that. Everything you see in a newspaper, magazine, a billboard, those little ads next to your Facebook, everything has been touched. And it doesn't mean that all the heads have been moved. It might, but in fact, I would say in most ads you've seen, stuff has been added or subtracted. In other words, the real world you think you're seeing in a Chanel ad or in an Annie Leibovitz Gucci purse kind of thingamathing, things have been added and subtracted. But just in general, everything has been touched. Contrast, tone, there's an atmosphere to photographs in the 2001s or in the 2020s, wherever we are, that is utterly created by Photoshop. Tonally, saturation, the look of photographs. You know, it used to be said, for example, that color photographs made with Kodachrome film had a certain look. And so basically everything you saw in National Geographic for 40 years had that Kodachrome look. We're all familiar with that. Well, now everything's got that Photoshop look, except that Photoshop has 150 flavors, tonalities, saturation, etc. And what that means is we are no longer in a world, a photographic world, that resembles your grandfather's photographic world. It doesn't resemble the photographic world that you grew up with, however old you are. And there's no sense bemoaning that. It is exactly what it is. And this is exactly our world now. It's not even a shame. If there are anybody left in the room who thinks the good old days were better, well, indeed they might have been, but they're gone. It's like the horse and buggy. Film, negatives, transparencies as a medium for capturing and reproducing are rare at best. Not many of us use film. Even when we do use film, we scan it into a digital environment and work on it on the computer. Nothing goes from a transparency zoom into a book anymore. Never happens. Everything is always mediated by digital technology. That's our world. And so it creates a look, a feel, a vibe, which is utterly unlike what has passed. And so that's our world. That's where we are. And the sky is the limit. And there's no sense trying to look back. So I think if that's not answer number two, that's part of answer number two. And answer number one for me would be simply, especially the modernists. So photographers beginning in 1920, their goal was to see photographically. And so for them, the fact that Van Gogh had made canvases, or Titian had made canvases, or El Greco, that's irrelevant to them. They need to, their belief and their mission was to see photographically, to see only with the camera and how the camera sees. That includes the chemistry. So we saw Man Ray doing his solarizations. As the technology changes, film becomes more sensitive, lenses become lighter and longer. Even those optical parts become more photographic and less painterly. So I would say to your question about didn't they have forebears in the visual arts? Yes, they did. Of course they did. Of course they did. And I would say all the great painters, the city painters and the religious painters, the Romantics, and then the Impressionists, then the Fauves and the Cubists, they all had huge influence on photographers. But once you put that camera up to your face in 1860, it becomes, I think, a whole different experience. It's, you will no longer have control of a canvas. You are kind of driving a machine, and that's different, I would say. So the answer, I mean, I don't think it's the answer. It's my feeling about your question is, yes, they all knew those forebears. Everybody knew J.M. Turner, especially the Impressionists, especially Stieglitz, those atmospheric effects, right? But by 1920, their job is to shed them entirely. I mean, it'd be like, you know, if you're Chuck, well, that's not a good example. If you are the Clash, your job is to not have any acoustic guitars or flutes. Pure Prairie League and Little River Band in 1978 can have flutes and acoustic guitars, but the Clash says nevermore, nevermore. And so it doesn't matter how Pure Prairie League arranged their little wimpy little operas. I'm sure that's like almost over all heads. Okay, anything else? So Rollins, does that make sense to you? Do you want to,
yeah. It made sense for sure. Thank you.
And again, you know, that's my point of view about it. And at this point, I'm ready to faint. I'm like going 90 miles an hour, but I'm actually ready to faint. So that's all I got under these circumstances.
Thank you, Tom. Do you want to? We have any other? Take one more question, maybe. Do we have anyone else that wants? You can just go ahead and unmute yourself. If you have any other questions, anyone has a question for Tom, you can just unmute yourself.
But Brandon, either after that question or in lieu of that question, I have one more thing to say about a separate thing. So just save me 30 seconds.
Okay. I just want to mention too that Jason, our producer, did post the information regarding the history of photography, the upcoming series, in a link for that. So everyone should have the dates and times. And Jason also put in a link for an evaluation for today. We really appreciate that. You know, it gives us a lot of good feedback. So if you would take some time to do that, we really appreciate it. Is there a last question that we could take before Tom wants to say a few words?
I think mostly everybody just wants to know if we're going to have Tom back to sort of finish the second half of this, which we should definitely look into at some point. So
Yeah,
everyone that's wondering, we will address this and we'll let everybody know. Nice.
I like the sound of that. Although when you say we're going to address this, I just get the willies. Like, I think I'm in trouble. I'm going to get addressed. But I'd be happy to come back and do the second half of this. So I guess one of the things I was going to say is, sorry we didn't get the whole thing. I have to tell you, 5 days ago, I had this idea about how to do this, plus something else on the side, plus this way of going at it. And then that went away. Like yesterday morning, I said, oh, we'll have no time for that. And then I said, oh, well, geez, this is way too cumbersome. And then it was, this morning it was this, and then this afternoon it was this, and now it's this. There's just not enough time to do all the wild ambitions I have for you. So sorry about that. If there's a way to extend this on another occasion, I, for one, will happy to be there. But just to say, in the meantime, as Brandon said, I do have a class I'm teaching, I think starts in 2 or 3 weeks. Actually, Brandon would know. And it might be photographing in the social landscape, which conveniently is, you would have learned so much about the social landscape if I had had another 45 minutes to show the next batch of photographers. That was exactly where we were headed, but that didn't happen, did it? So anyway, the social landscape is the environment in which we live and work. Photographing in the social landscape requires a kind of feeling for what it is and how we can respond to it in certain photographic ways. So anyway, that's a class that I'll be teaching, a 6-week workshop starting, I don't know, Brandon will know, the 15th or 25th or something like that.
September 24th is the date. I did post the link in the chat feature. And I also posted a link, Tom, for your class, The Photographer's Eye, which starts November 10th. So people have a link for that as well.
So I'd be delighted to have any of you guys join me. Especially Lev Shapiro that's a good looking guy. I hope he comes to my class.
Tom, thank you. Thank you. You are amazing. It is a lot of work to put this together with all those slides. It is a huge undertaking, and it does not go unnoticed the time that you put in for this. It's incredible. You are amazing. We will work this out.
Too much, dude. Too much.
It's overwhelming. Everyone wants a part 2. We don't have a choice.
I don't even know.
We gotta do it.
I'm getting drunk tonight.
No worries there. Thank you again. Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you, folks.